account two central features of media development. The first part had to do with coverage of elections, but there's a second very important part, which is concerned with the area of media self-regulation in the Caribbean. Now, my organization has been charged with the responsibility of coming up with a sort of conceptual framework for media self-regulation in the Caribbean. And the reason why I'm not wearing my glasses is because I have a little bit of an old people problem I'm dealing with, where I didn't walk with my my reading glasses. So as it is right now, I can read what's in front of me here, but I can't see too much of what's going on there. So if you see me addressing the wrong slide, that's the excuse. And I'm joined this afternoon by Joel Nanton from COSTAT, who is going to introduce some of the related aspects of media self-regulation that focus on media ethics and standards. And he has had the opportunity, as hopefully some of you, if not most of you, to look at a discussion paper that I have prepared on the issue. It ought to have been emailed to everybody yesterday. I had hoped it would have been done before, but did everybody receive this document in their email? No. Okay, well, I'll make sure you have it by the end of the afternoon. Media self-regulation. Well, voluntary media self-regulation is one pole or one coordinate in a spectrum of interventions that range from voluntary self-regulation to official regulation. There are some people like me who stand on the more libertarian side, not in the US political context, John, so don't get worried, who believe that perhaps there's another end of the spectrum that should be defined as a zone in which there's no regulation. Because there's a philosophical view, of course, that the best societies are those in which you don't really need too many laws to govern appropriate and proper behavior, but that through education and awareness and people acquiring a high level of consciousness, there would no longer be the need really for all these laws. Now that's a very hard concept for Caribbean people to grasp, because we essentially emerge out of an authoritarian culture. People believe in more laws. People think that the better societies are those with more laws and with more effective laws and with penalties that punish people as efficiently and as harshly as possible. But I think that one of the solutions to Caribbean development is for people to start moving away from this authoritarian culture and to move more in the direction of people accepting responsibility for themselves as individuals and as communities. So that's the sort of philosophical framework from which I approach this particular topic. And that's why I would break ranks with a lot of people who have written on this issue to suggest that the spectrum related to regulation of the media should start at one end with no regulation and end at the extreme tip of this pyramid with the law. That the law essentially should be the last resort as opposed to the first resort. The default position of most of our societies, and here in Trinidad and Tobago is the same, is one of law and regulation as opposed to allowing people to be responsible for themselves. So that we judge political performance, for example, by the number of laws that are passed by our government. I know it's very often a guide to people when they speak about who, and this is without comment on any partisan thing, because it's the same thing I'm going to say in St. Lucia and the same thing I will say in Jamaica, that we make judgments about the performance, let's say, of somebody like the Attorney General by pointing to the number of laws they've been able to successfully enact. When I think that the higher the level of civilization, that the the positive side of the spectrum would be the fewer laws they would have had to impose. So I'm going to start the spectrum by saying perhaps no regulation should be a starting point. And I've said more than once in more than one forum that in my view the best media regulation is no regulation. Now, much support for the notion of more freedom as opposed to more official regulation is derived from an understanding of the potential developmental impact of liberalized mass communication arrangements and recognition of the value of free expression as an asset in the strengthening of the democratic process. So in my view, it's axiomatic that the more expression you have and the freer that expression is, the greater the prospects for development. In introducing, and you see, this is not a minority view in the free expression community. Because in the discussion paper, I quote the Director General of UNESCO, who in UNESCO's publication on World Trends in Freedom of Expression and Media Development, who said that a new global sustainable development agenda must be underpinned and driven by human rights with particular attention to freedom of expression. So I would say that freedom of expression is both a vital pillar and byproduct of a liberal democracy. It serves as a self-propagating instrument of social change, and its protection can contribute to the building of platforms for good governance, democracy, and, well, the consequential benefits of having good governance and democracy, which would be human and social development. The stronger the democracy, the better the chance you have of achieving human and social development. The media, as one formal manifestation of this freedom, can serve and already do serve as interlocutors between the powerful and the powerless, with a role as independent watchdogs on the exercise of both state and private power. And the discussion we had before lunch regarding advertising proves the point that the influences that come to bear on freedom of expression are not only inhibited by state actors. It's not only the government or a political party that exert negative influences on freedom of the press. There are private actors as well. And you will find, and in your own practice as journalists, that private sector censorship is just as powerful, if not more powerful, than state official censorship. The pressure you come upon in the newsroom with respect to stories that you can cover freely and those that you cannot cover freely are far more influenced by commercial factors as opposed to political factors. I mean, I've been in the business for some time, and I can tell you that that was my lived reality for a very long time. That the incursion of commercial interests in your newsroom is a far more powerful influence on the content than the political pressures that are brought to bear. Now, one of the recent developments are a lot of people looking at self-regulation, an issue that they have looked at very closely, has been the Leveson Commission and the report of the Sir Brian Leveson Commission in the United Kingdom. And everybody knows what I'm talking about, right? The Leveson report in the UK that was linked to the performance of the press and ethics and standards and so on. I will talk a little bit more, I'll explain a little bit more of the significance of that report and how it expresses itself in British law in a short while. But it's a very important piece of work that was done in the United Kingdom following what were considered to be the excesses of certain sectors of the print media, the Rupert Murdoch issue and so on, just to draw a name that's familiar to everybody. Well, Sir Brian Leveson, in his report on the inquiry, which happened in 2012, concluded that for many years there have been complaints that certain parts of the press ride roughshod over others, both individuals and the public at large, without any justifiable public interest. And the way that he couched this statement is such that we would understand that there is a public interest consideration when looking at perceived excesses or malpractice in the media. To put it another way, that there are certain breaches of accepted norms that can occur if there is a public interest factor or element involved in it. So for example, you might have codes of conduct that speak about the preservation of information on the health of individuals, which is something we sort of observe as a matter of course. So we know, for example, the HIV status of someone is not something you would want to mention in your story. The sexual orientation of an individual can be something you can be guided by. And those of you who follow my online activity would know how much I ranted and raved about a headline in the Jamaica Observer 2 weeks ago, where it was stated, the headline read, "Gays arrested in so-and-so assault case." So that of course is a no-no, and I'm very strong on that point of inserting the sexual orientation or the health status of somebody. But there might be a public interest concern or public interest element of the story that would justify moving away from that general principle. What about the health status of the Prime Minister or a senior government minister or the leader of the opposition? Wouldn't that be something you would think you should weigh? We have had instances in the past here where, and it's in Vincent, it occurred just 2 weeks ago, where a senior politician would just disappear to seek medical treatment. Now, if that person is the leader of the opposition, the Prime Minister, the Chief Justice, or somebody of that standing, then there might be a public interest defense with respect to getting into, well, what is the nature of the illness? How serious is it? Those of you who would have covered the situation in Nigeria, where the former president of Nigeria left, quote unquote, for treatment. I think it was in Switzerland or wherever it was. Was it Switzerland? I can't remember. Italy. Left for treatment and because of some undisclosed illness. And he actually died. He died, and it became a big issue, but it was generally frowned upon in Nigeria, any kind of speculation surrounding the nature of the illness. So the general point I'm making here is that and it's reflected in Sir Levison's statement, that there can be a kind of public interest derogation of certain set principles, but it needs to be very clearly expressed. It's not an arbitrary kind of process. And in fact, so concerned was Levison about some of these malpractices that he even proposed, and this is something that can go into a model if we ever decide to get into a model prescription for the Caribbean or even for Trinidad and Tobago. He went so far as prescribing a form of whistleblower protection for journalists who feel that they might be under pressure to do things that were unethical or against the code. And maybe some of us might be able to associate with that. The editor who brings pressure on you to do something that you are not very comfortable with. And during the Levison inquiry, there were several instances where journalists testified that they participated in the whole wiretapping issue and phone tapping, much against their better conscience, and they thought that something was wrong, but they weren't really open about talking about it or writing about it or discussing it with their colleagues because they thought they would be fired or punished in some kind of way. And what Leveson has inserted into that debate is this whole matter of whether there shouldn't be, under the ambit of self-regulation, some kind of whistleblower provision, so that if you are under pressure in your newsroom to commit something unethical, you ought to be able to go to your media council or whatever instrument that you have. And by the way, Kiran would probably remind us a little later that the Media Complaints Council is undergoing a process of review at the moment. And hopefully some of these things can be inserted into the discussion. Of course, you know, there'll be concern about the makeup of the council and so on, and I'm going to get to that. There's also a long-held view a long-held view that, and it was reflected in a study that was done in New Zealand. And again, you know, I point to inquiries and studies and all these things in some other Commonwealth countries that basically have a culture of applying a certain level of science and analysis to the things that they do. In my respectful view, I don't think that in our cultures we really spend too much time clinically dissecting these issues and coming up with solutions and proposals for changing them. We operate too much on intuition and how people feel, and the politicians vex with us. So back in 1997, the TTPBA went very quickly into formation of a Media Complaints Council after the publication of the Green Paper on a responsible press by the government at that time. I'm not knocking the MCC. I think it has developed, and there's scope for it developing even more, and they're engaging that process. But the thing is that the impetus to take us to regulatory media self-regulation should not be a big blade over our necks. It ought to be taken as something, as a matter of course, and it should be evidence and fact-based. It must be based on a level of analysis. Well, in New Zealand, they did a study when the government of the time and the media industry generally became a little concerned about the impact of social media and the fact that people operating in the sphere of social media were not subject to the same kinds of professional obligations as journalists in the mainstream media. There was this concern, and indeed there's that concern here. In New Zealand, they made an attempt to understand this. So the government at the time commissioned a study on this notion of media regulation and how that related to social media vis-a-vis the mainstream media. And they basically concluded that the role has a role to play in holding the news media, that the law has a role to play not only in regulating media and regulating all these things, but it has a role to play in holding the news media accountable to the public for the exercise of their powers. And the thinking there is that we make a big fuss about freedom of the press and freedom of expression. And in the press in particular, we insist that we ought to be free and independent to do our work. And that's a right that this country, Trinidad and Tobago, has given us very specifically through our constitution. We are the only country in the English-speaking Caribbean with freedom of the press entrenched in our constitution. Everywhere else, there's a general safeguard of freedom of expression, under which freedom of the press is derived. But in Trinidad and Tobago, we have a specific freedom of the press provision, which has incidentally has been tested. And if you have time and inclination, you can go back to a Privy Council judgment that involved the provision of foreign currency for the TNT Mirror to buy newsprint, which they claimed was held by the then Minister of Industry, who happened himself to be a former media magnate at the time, Ken Gordon. And the judgment on that is very instructive because it points specifically to freedom of the press and the fact that simply by denying access to foreign currency to purchase newsprint meant that there was an inhibition on freedom of the press. So this was not a government minister or the police or something going into a newsroom, or the prime minister parking his car in front of your studio and storming into it and saying, no, fellas, I don't like what you say, so shut up. This is not even that. This went into providing the means by which the press can do its work. Because bear in mind, and this, a lot of people overlook this, that the human right that's related to this is freedom of expression. And freedom of expression is a process that does not only involve the expression of someone, but it is a process that involves the right to seek expression, to seek opinion, to seek analysis, to seek news, to seek information, the right of your society, that's freedom of expression, to access, and the right to seek it, and the right to receive it. So that right is not only the right of the journalist to have his or her story published and for it to be disseminated, but it's the right of the readers of your newspaper to be able to seek it. So it might be that there is a law, and I believe, John, in Brazil, there was once an issue regarding the operations of newspaper vendors selling a particular newspaper. Mightn't be Brazil, I'm not sure. And it became a press freedom issue because it's not that anybody was not permitting the journalist to write the story and the newspaper to publish it, but there was a restriction on the ability of people to find this newspaper. And then there was, as a result, an inability to receive the content of the newspaper. And that in itself is an inhibition on freedom of the press. The paper also points to a 2004 issue which talks about the Australian media. And that paper looked at regulation, self-regulation, the public interest, and free speech. And the basic argument against government regulation of the media there spoke about placing the public interest at the forefront. Now, this public interest argument is very live, by the way, with respect to the current GISL issue with broadcasters and the use of the 60-minute slot. Those of you who have been following the issue would probably want to know, where do we position an imposition such as that vis-a-vis the whole debate on freedom of the press? And it is a factor, because the justification of the law in Trinidad, the regulation, is that the government, whichever government is in power at the time, is entitled, as a matter of right, as a matter of the broadcasting arrangements between the state and broadcasters, entitled to position information on your medium in the public interest. And I know there's a lively debate. I sat in on one discussion once with the then Minister of Legal Affairs, the Minister of Information, TTPBA, and some other actors in the room. And I remember one of the people on the other side of the table saying, but certainly it must be the government who determines what's in the public interest. Well, that's when I had to not shut up, because the issue of the public interest, at law, there is no public interest regulation per se, but there are issues that related to public interest that need to be taken into account, particularly when you're measuring public interest vis-a-vis freedom of expression. So this study that was done in 2004 in Australia said that the public interest is at the forefront, and the emphasis is on the principle that an independent media will foster free speech, which will be jeopardized by concentrating too much power over into the hands of the government. Oops, sorry. So that's the quote there. Then came 2007, 2008. I'm not going to bore everybody too much. I'm just going to flag some of the main issues. In Jamaica, one of the campaigns that the ACM has had over the years is the elimination of criminal defamation from our statute books. And you would be aware of the work that we've done here in collaboration with IPI to have criminal defamation erased from the statute books, and there has been a partial erasure of that. In Jamaica, the campaign basically took root back in 2006, 2007, and what the government at the day said, well, yes, we understand where you're coming. People should not be imprisoned for things that they say or write or express via art or whatever cultural expression. Let's commission a study. So they set up a committee under Justice Hugh Small, and they looked specifically at the defamation laws in Jamaica between 2007 and 2008. And one of the conclusions they came to was that the committee considers that the state should not be involved in regulation of the media. And this is where Justice Small, who I had the opportunity to do some work with, really went back to my pyramid. Yeah, he perhaps premeditated my my press regulation pyramid, because what he basically is saying is that the state should not be involved in regulation of the media at all, as this would be contrary to the constitutional principles of freedom of expression. The press and journalists in several common law countries have established their own organizations. And remember, just take into consideration a certain level of context here, because in Jamaica, the equivalent of the Media Association of Trinidad and Tobago is the Press Association of Jamaica, which is now probably like 80 years old. And they're very vibrant. They own property. There's nothing that happens. They are landlords, so they earn an income through rental of a property that they acquired over the years. Nothing is contemplated regarding media law, anything to do with the media, without recourse to the Press Association of Jamaica. Correspondingly, where we have the TTPBA in Trinidad and Tobago, you have the Media Association of Jamaica. And they are very well entrenched, they are a very cohesive body, and I think that unlike the case of MAT and the PAJ, the TTPBA is really very reflective of the kind of dynamism and influence, because you would note that proposed changes to laws and so on, the TTPBA is regularly consulted. And I think that MAT that's one of the things you need to look at. Remember at our general meeting last year, I said, when we heard the report of the PAJ, Akash, you were in the room, right? When we were talking about it, I said, maybe, not completely, because there are some issues with the PAJ in terms of who they allow as members, which is something Matt has spoken about. But look at how the PAJ operates. Their profile is so high and the influence is so great that when the Justice Small report was issued, the judge felt so impressed by what he had seen that he said that this thing of media regulation is something that we inimical to freedom of expression, and that there are organizations who monitor press freedoms and enforce appropriate ethical standards for the practice of journalism. There's another dynamic that I'll get to in a short while. So I'll say that the development of a conceptual framework for media self-regulation in our region would benefit from a clinical examination of the performance of both existing and proposed statutorily determined content restrictions. And as I said, we believe in law and regulation and banning and stopping and all this kind of thing. So every other day, and if you take a close look, when people ask the question, do we have freedom of the press in Trinidad and Tobago? There are different ways you can answer that. Yes, there is freedom of the press, where by and large, journalists do write stories, and with few exceptions, by and large, you get your stories in without too much of a fuss. But 95% of the time, depending on which media house you're with, 95% of the time. Get 95? but not 100%. So by and that's the internal dynamic. But in terms of what cannot be written, we operate in a minefield of restrictions. And you could just look at the rules of court, Supreme Court of Judicature Act, even the summary offenses. There's a whole, it's not only defamation, it's not only blasphemy, it's not only legislation that deals with the Equal Opportunity Act. All of these pieces of legislation, the new broadcast code, as even though it's more enlightened than previous versions, there are still restrictions in there that you should pay attention to, because even though the officialdom might at this time be turning a relatively blind eye to these issues, any Monday morning you can wake up and find to knocking at your door and a boot standing outside your front door, because you have breached any one of scores of laws that inhibit your freedom to report what you wish. So Justice Small, in my view, released quite an enlightened report, 2007, 2008, and as a consequence of that, Jamaica was the first country to completely eliminate criminal defamation. And one of the other things that they did with respect to the civil jurisdiction is that they mandated, that the law mandates that there ought to be proportionality with respect to the award of damages for civil defamation, in the civil defamation cases. Meaning that if you defame somebody, let us say you commit an act of defamation against a government minister, and it relates to use of narcotic, right? And that minister decides to sue or whatever it is. They ought to be, if it's proven, if the case is proven, then the extent of damages ought to be proportionate to the degree of damage actually caused, personal injury actually sustained. As it is right now, there is scope, abundant scope for disproportionate awards. So I can cite a Grenada case where the Grenada informer, Grenada News, was forced to close because the level of award against it by an action taken by the Prime Minister was way in excess of all the assets of all the directors. And they just simply had to file for bankruptcy and close down the business. So there must be proportionality with respect to, and that's now entrenched in the Jamaican defamation law, but in Trinidad and Tobago that does not obtain. And I mean, not that it's any comfort, but in the United Kingdom, there's also a tendency to be disproportionate. And this is a backlash from irresponsible, excessive behavior by the press there, to the extent that, because online content, you can be sued for defamation for online content anywhere that material is accessible or accessed. So if you write a story that appears on the online version of the Express and it's accessed in London, somebody can sue you in the UK jurisdiction for defamation. And in the United Kingdom, because these awards tend to be the punitive measures that are imposed are so extreme that there's something now called libel tourism, where a lot of these guys who looking to get a little extra change, they sue in the UK jurisdiction and they extract disproportionate share of punishment for whatever defamation. So we need to develop into that thing, cast our minds as to the level of punishment under some of these laws. Now, I spoke about the Leveson Commission or inquiry. And one of the things, okay, I will come to Article 19 in a short while. One of the things, the outcomes of the Leveson inquiry was actual legislation, and not only regular legislation, but a royal charter. Now, in the UK, a charter is a law. A royal charter is a law, but not in the sense of a law that was passed and debated in the parliament. It's an imposition by the monarch. So this is something that the Queen attaches her signature to. Following the Leveson Inquiry report, the UK government actually developed a royal charter on self-regulation in the press, in the UK press. This was in 2013, and in fact, that charter is due to take effect next year. Now, it is almost ironic, and something you need to bear in mind, that here you have legislation on self-regulation. So that makes my pyramid irrelevant, because self-regulation is supposed to be, you know, free people getting together and saying, well, listen, between us, we're not going to do this, that, and, well, if I find you sticking your hand in the cookie jar, I'll give you 2 taps on your head, right? But that's us, right? But this is somebody from the outside coming now and laying down the law saying, okay, I want you and you to come to this agreement. And that basically is what the Royal Charter does. And to some extent, when we say that we oppose state regulation, even state regulation that mandates self-regulation is something that you need to look carefully at, because it really is a certain amount of trickery involved. So sometimes you hear people talk about co-regulation. Co-regulation is itself a bit of a myth. Although co-regulation can exist to the extent where you probably would have a law or a regulation, and this is a way that the broadcast code could have possibly be handled, where under the Telecommunications Act, there's this requirement for a broadcast code. They could have done it such that, okay, so a broadcast code is necessary to administer the Telecommunications Act, but that broadcast code is going to be developed by the media industry. And we mandate that you abide by your own promise to yourself that you're not going to do this, you're not going to do that. And you would agree whether the punishment is state-imposed or is a punishment you administer between yourselves. So there is a model that was proposed at the Leveson Inquiry in anticipation of this law, the Royal Charter. And it was put together by a guy called Lord Black. If I saw him, he was online. There was a story about him online. He just won an award for something related to freedom of the press. He's a member of the House of Lords, and very influential, very wealthy man, and he owns one of the major newspapers. I can't remember. And he basically had proposed that kind of model where it might be that you want to, as a society, say you're going to have laws to regulate the media, but that the framework for it should be designed by the media themselves, and that they can prescribe penalties, some of the penalties that would be actionable by the state, so that in the new model that was put together by the Royal Charter, some of that was taken on board. Now, Article 19 puts into the picture several other provisos, and this is because of their understanding of international human rights judgments at the level of the European Court on Human Rights, where they're saying that judicial precedent had set certain standards for media regulation, for media self-regulation, media regulation, which is that, one, the regulation ought to be prescribed by law. So to some extent, the broadcast code is prescribed by the Telecommunications Act, so it meets that particular standard. That there is a legitimate aim, so there must be a legitimate justification for the imposition of this media regulation. And most of the times, the justification is advanced that it is there to protect the rights of others. So in the broadcast code at one time, they said it was for the protection of social standards and morals and this kind of stuff or whatever. And then Later on, it became the protection of children. And that's where the whole benchmark thing came into being, where after a certain hour, you can't show certain content because children might be viewing and something. And the third justification would be that regulations are, as a matter of course, necessary in a democratic society. That a society needs, as a general rule, to set standards for itself, otherwise you're going to have mass mayhem. But the last thing, which is that, okay, regulations are necessary. Regulations are necessary in a democratic society, but the qualification there is that there must be a pressing social need, and that it ought to be proportionate to the interests sought. So let us say the rationale behind the broadcast code is to protect children. At one time they were really big on that. And the watershed time was the big issue, and any time before 7 you can't show certain types of content and so on. Well, it must be proportionate to the interests sought. So you cannot come and say that you're protecting children, but you're protecting children up to midnight on television, because that won't be proportionate. Because what you're doing is that net now is being swept. And that's the kind of thinking, if you trace the history of how the Censors Board operates in Trinidad and Tobago, ratings weren't always the standard they used. On one extreme end was banning, and the movies have been banned completely in Trinidad and Tobago, which of course now with Netflix, and you go and you download anything that you want. I'm against all censorship anyway. So I think that to the extent that we can defy all these foolish rules, we should defy them. But the rules cannot be disproportionate. You cannot say that you're going to protect the right of one group, let us say a religious group, and deny the other religious group the opportunity to state its view. There's a provision in the broadcast code, for example, which talks about people who are saying things that are derogatory to someone else's religion. Now that automatically, those guys under the tent all over the country, spreading the word, they're in problems, because they're telling Hindus and Muslims, you go to hell, you go dead, what you're doing is sin, you're bad. What the Imam just tell you down the road, that will send you to hell. So if you apply that very strictly under the broadcast code or the Equal Opportunity Act, the Equal Opportunity Act has such a provision as well. And I would say vice versa in terms of the different groups that you're dealing with. But that's where sometimes we don't think things through. And if we do, we don't think about it in a framework of more freedom as opposed to less freedom. Because the default is less freedom, then you'll ban what the preacher man say, instead of saying, well, let's work out some rules of the game now. Such as is happening now with respect to the conduct of political parties at election time. You know, instead of resorting to some rule or regulation that say, well, you're not supposed to say this, that, or the other, you get together, which such as the IRO did, and they say, well, okay, let's set some rules of the game among ourselves now. We know people will breach it. I always cite the example of Guyana, where there's a code of conduct for elections, and it's monitored by the Elections Commission, a very independent operation within GCOM. And they do, at the height of elections, they do weekly reports. And the chief culprits have always and routinely been the state media. They break the rule routinely. Although they themselves were the ones saying, well, look, the media are wild and this one thing. I mean, and if you know the Guyanese media, you know the amount of wildness that goes on there. It's just unbelievable. But then in the New Zealand study, coming back to that very briefly, Kiran, give me a wave because I don't want to forget Joel, right? You ready for me to done? Okay, let me skip them. People have the paper to take, people. And I've seen some people yawning. They lunch did that. one of the important features to bear in mind as we think about media regulation here is that just like in New Zealand, they recognize that there's a lack of parity in the regulations that apply to print media as opposed to the regulations that apply to broadcast media. Broadcast media have more direct controls than print media. In fact, all broadcast houses in Trinidad and Tobago are subject to prior censorship. And it's built into your broadcast license. In your broadcast license, it's said very clearly what you cannot say. In the print media, there is no such restriction. You know that they apply for a broadcast license here, and they are fully entitled to say that we don't want you to say anything that would have a negative, that would portray the country in a negative way and to affect the tourism industry. Which the broadcast code said at one stage, one of the early incarnations of the broadcast code, words to that effect were uttered. And they sent it to me for comment, and I said, look, get serious now. We're going to challenge this right to the Inter-American Court because that's unconstitutional. But there are such provisions that radio and television stations routinely sign on to. And it's really a form of prior censorship, where even before, it's like the case that Jones spoke about earlier, where no story gets published yet, but you get an injunction. You get a legal thing before a word is mentioned. Well, radio and TV stations do that routinely when they apply for their license, because they say well in advance of any story being written about X, they agree that they're not going to write about X. And that's prior censorship. So let me leave you with this. This is what the Royal Charter, this is what is going to take effect in the United Kingdom from next year. And it looks a little bit convoluted, and there's an explanation that Kiran won't allow me to get into. Yes, I know you won't. But as you review the Media Complaints Council, I think you should be guided by some of the principles of the Royal Charter. Not that the Royal Charter is expected to be a model for us, because even within that, there is this flavor of the 11th inquiry, which was sort of negative towards freedom of the press as far as I'm concerned. But that there ought to be functions within your regulatory, your self-regulatory environment, which not only looks at complaints, but would look at operational issues tied to the work of the press. Incidentally, the charter applies only to the print media, because there's an entirely different regime that goes into effect for broadcast. But I think it would make sense in our societies to have the same thing. I would say that in Jamaica there's a similar model for broadcast media, and they're not my best friends in the Broadcast Commission of Jamaica, because in my view they operate under a regime of censorship. The Broadcast Commission of Jamaica, they maintain and review a blacklist of music that's not to be played on Jamaican radio. And I looked at that list on one occasion, and I saw the Mighty Sparrow must be there about a dozen times. Sorry? I can't remember the song, but I know Saltfish would be one for sure. and Lizard and all that. So they maintain this. Now, in our meeting with the minister and so on that time, Kiran, there was one government operative who said that, and that's one of the reasons why I'm opposed completely to local content quotas, because that's an inhibition on freedom of expression. If the format of my station is to play American rubbish, all due respect, John, I should be free to do that. And there's something called the remote control. You could flick to the other station. So I'd give people choice. So if you want to listen to a certain kind of rubbish, I reserve the right to listen to the rubbish of my choice. John has had to endure my West African music since yesterday. Yes, Fela is the greatest. Anyhow, so, but I reserve the right to listen to the rubbish of my choice as an adult, as I should be allowed to view the rubbish of my choice as an adult. Because don't forget, we're going back to the thing about yesterday, but you need to protect the children, and you need to ensure that there's no expression that you're exposing people to that will generate hatred against others to the extent that the people want to go out and commit acts of violence against them or to discriminate against them. So, Kiran, sorry, I just want to point out a few failed attempts in the region. There was a Caribbean Press Council, which was meant to operate something like the CCJ, which was a supranational self-regulatory body for the press, administered and controlled by the Caribbean Publishers and Broadcasters Association, which would have been the forerunner to TTPBA, because the idea really was that you have the CPTA, and under the CPTA you have TTPBA in Trinidad, MAJ in Jamaica, and elsewhere. They set up this Caribbean Press Council back in 1976, and that crashed. It was basically force-fed to the region by UNESCO. But not that we disagree with UNESCO's position on these things, but you cannot impose what you consider to be a third world template on the region just so that whatever we come up with has to be because we have thought about it and this is our idea. So that collapsed. There was an attempt at setting up an Eastern Caribbean Press Council with the 7 OECS members back in 2002. That crashed. And we are left in the region, in the entire region, we are left with the Media Complaints Council of Trinidad and Tobago, which has the opportunity to set the stage or to set the lead for the rest of the region. And I think that as the TTPBA reviews the MCC, they should take on board the views of other stakeholders in and out of the media with respect to strengthening the MCC, because it plays a leadership role in the region. I think much to the credit, even though we know that it was born in sin because of the work of the government of the day back in '97, it sets the stage. The other little model that we have is the Election Commission in Guyana and their administration of our broadcast code, where they have media monitoring. So this does not rely on somebody coming to complain. This is having an authority that monitors the media independently. This is not TAT. This is a private independent organization monitoring. You have a complaints mechanism that's initiated by the commission. You have independent refereeing. In the election of 2006 in Jamaica, in Guyana, we had media referees. Lennox Grant from Trinidad and Wyvern Gager from Jamaica were media referees who, when the monitoring unit issued these reports, if a media house thought that they were being unfair, the media referees would take up the issue. So I'm going to end there. The paper has been circulated, and hopefully you'll have a read of it. I want to invite Joel now to speak on some of the observations.